Well, functionalists argue that stratification is always useful, and conflict theorists, especially Marx, argue that stratification is fundamentally the result of sort of greed and exploitation. There are sort of other perspectives on this kind of stratification. One of those comes to us from an interactionist kind of perspective, um, which is to say that it recognizes sort of both pieces, in that instead of distributing things based on social need, which is kind of what Marx is advocating for, that you give resources to the people who need them, you don't just give more to the people who already have lots, um, but that we distribute things of value on the basis of both social need, um, and power. And that becomes really, really important when we start digging into sort of postmodernism questions, which are not in your textbook, but like postmodernism questions, right? As soon as you start talking about power, right? And as soon as you start talking about something like needs, the question becomes, so what counts as a need? And that's one of the conversations in your discussion forums about like, hey, what do we even include in our measurements of poverty? So like, don't take this sort of symbolic interactionist perspective as like a perfect happy middle ground, because it is definitely infused with all kinds of other discussions that we're having. Um, but Lenski's idea when he's talking about that is that human economies tend to produce some kind of surplus value, especially industrial ones, which is basically that when you take raw resources and you transform them into something else, that you have created value, and in doing so, you have created more value than the strict value of the labor that you put in to do that. Marx says the same thing. He just argues that that's what capitalists steal. Um, Lenski's argument is that like when you turn a tree or six trees into a ship, right? You are producing extra value over top of the amount of hours that had to go into doing that. And his argument is that that sort of social good will be distributed based on both societal needs and power. So, yes, if you can extract more value out of that interaction, as for example, the shipwright or the owner of the shipyard, you will do so. But that doesn't mean that you're keeping all of the surplus value for yourself, because it would also be in your interest, to, for example, not have your employees coming at you with pitchforks or trying to burn your house down and steal your stuff. So in that circumstance, one of sort of Lenski's argument is that, well, okay, but if the company is doing well, it might make sense to pay employees better instead of just having the owners steal everything, because it allows those employees to stay, it prevents people from leaving, it does all kinds of like things that are actually beneficial to owners too, right? This is sort of part of the argument that we could definitely have around lots of forms of social policy too. That, for example, it's really useful to employers to be working in a society where we consider education to be a basic public good that we provide to everyone, because it means that if you are an employer, you don't really have to struggle or worry about having to teach someone how to read and write before they come to work for you, because you already have another social institution that is providing that. Okay. And Lenski's idea there is that you should see more equity between sort of the people who have lots and the people who have way less, um, as there is more surplus to go around. In that, if there's only so much surplus for one member of society to have like running water and flush toilets, then that person is likely going to take all of it. But that there becomes a point essentially where it's more valuable to make sure everyone has running water than for you to have like there's a certain point at which you cannot make use of it, right? Like I have running water in my house, but running a second water line to my house doesn't actually add quality of life, right? Um, and so his argument there, and like there's also a lot of sort of other pieces like that, right? in that being able to feed my family the food that I want to feed them is important. But once we have got all the food that we want and can eat, more does not make our lives better, right? So in that circumstance, Lenski's argument is that like people at the top will wind up sharing more when they have more. This is kind of a trickle down economics kind of question, but it is a little bit more complicated than that. Um, and this is a really interesting theory because it seems to be playing out well in some areas of the world and not at all in others. And so the example your book talks about is countries like Sweden. Most of Scandinavia, so Norway, Finland, Denmark, all of those countries are going to see something relatively similar in that the gap between the very wealthiest people and the very poorest people is actually relatively small, which is sort of a way of saying that people who have a lot of money, people who run companies who do that sort of thing, tend to pay their employees more. People tend to vote for higher taxes on people who are relatively wealthy, which means higher quality public services. It works really well in some countries, and it doesn't work at all very well elsewhere. So, for example, on paper, the United States is one of the richest countries in the world. And they have levels of inequality. We could talk about measures, but that doesn't matter. They have levels of inequality that are sort of similar to levels of inequality, for example, in what we would otherwise call developing countries, which are sort of known for like, especially like if you look at like countries that are well known for corruption and dictatorships, you're seeing levels of wealth inequality that are similar in that sort of vein. So one of the things that we have to understand in terms of that is this is a symbolic interactionist theory, and one of the reasons we treat it as a symbolic interactionist theory is that the difference between the two, the difference between places where the gap between the rich and the poor is shrinking in industrial capitalism where we have lots of surplus, and where it's actually widening in that same circumstance, has a lot to do with how people interpret the people around them. In that, in most of Scandinavia, there's sort of a shared understanding of who the state is responsible for, who benefits from the state. All of those things are pretty well shared, which means that the people at the top think about themselves as being the same or as members of the same group as the people at the bottom. And that works really well in Scandinavia, largely because the population shares very similar languages, very similar histories, very similar cultural backgrounds. It's racially quite homogenous. By and large, there hasn't been a ton of immigration into Scandinavian countries, which makes that kind of sort of argument relatively easy. In the United States, which is sort of the clearest example, but it definitely happens in Canada too, part of what you're seeing when you're seeing that widening gap between the rich and the poor is actually about whether or not people are like you or not, and whether or not the people who need support are like you and have made good choices. So a really clear example of how that sort of thing works is to say that I imagine many of you have heard politicians complain about people living on welfare. Usually this is politicians on the right, but not always, who sort of say that like people are just making bad choices and expecting the government to pay for it. That rhetoric, that kind of discussion doesn't exist when welfare policies are introduced. Welfare policies were introduced after the Second World War, mostly as a way of providing an income and sort of some stability to women whose husbands had died during the war. And the way that that was sort of conceptualized in the public consciousness, they understood these women as having made an important sacrifice for their country, and there wasn't a conversation that they had made the wrong choice. Okay? But over time, sort of, especially through the 60s, with the advent primarily of birth control, right? One of the things that sort of shifted was how the public understood people who accepted sort of social security and income security payments, in that they were sort of perceived less as people who had made all the right choices but hit some kind of unpredictable disaster, right? in a lot of ways, like, there's no logic to which woman becomes a war widow and which one doesn't, because their husbands are fighting together and it's just a question of where the bullet landed, right? But when women start having access to birth control, you see shifts in how people are understood, in that the people who are accepting welfare payments or income security, especially women, are increasingly being categorized and understood as people who have made poor choices, who are not sort of using birth control effectively. You'll have sort of conversations where people saying, well, they're having kids on purpose so that they don't have to work. That kind of rhetorical shift around how people in poverty are understood, right, as somehow different and outside of the sort of group of good citizens who pays their taxes and works really hard and pays for everything, right? When you start separating those groups, you also see policy changes that make welfare rates and sort of the policies for like the qualifications for receiving them more and more stringent, make the rates lower and lower relative to sort of normal incomes in society. So in 1947, right, when sort of income security payments come out, like, you're not living in poverty if you're accepting income support payments from the government. You may not be living like the richest life in the world, but you're able to sort of pay your bills and meet, right, that modest standard of living that we're sort of talking about in our market basket measures and our poverty line cutoffs. Now, that is not the case. Now, welfare, like, if you accept welfare payments, you are probably going to be living in poverty even with those payments, because the rates themselves are not sufficient. And a large part of that is, again, about that interpretation part, and interpretation of who is doing the things that are necessary to sort of receive support from the state, who is worthy of it. And by and large, in North America in particular, we've sort of seen this interpretation that the people who have money made good choices and the people who don't have money made bad ones, and that the government is not responsible for responding to bad choices. And that sort of is part of this sort of question about how do we interpret this? How do we allocate surplus? And it's part of what we mean when we talk about the idea of societal need and power, right? As I said, this is connected to postmodernism, and that, remember, the question of what's a need and who has them is absolutely sort of one of power, and the people who control power and control that narrative can shift a lot of things in society.